So let's talk briefly about grief. For many of you, you may have traveled a lot with grief, but I am one of the privileged people in the world for whom grief was not something that I experienced in a massive way, and until my mother was diagnosed when I was 42 years old with a terminal disease. And we did not know how long she would still be with us, but we did know that she was not going to be able to be cured. I grew up on a farm in just outside of Vancouver in Canada, and so I grew up with a lot of farm-related loss and death of animals. But other than that, and having, of course, lost my grandparents, I'd been quite insulated from it. And so I was kind of profoundly disoriented about what was going on with me. And I think it's useful to acknowledge that there has been quite a bit of work done on grief over the years. But that most of what we're beginning to learn about grief is relatively new. So most people date the first studies of grief to Freud's famous study, Melancholy and Mourning, where he talked about the difference between the first sort of stage of grief, perhaps you want to use the term of stages, where you're just profoundly kind of sad and dwelling on sadness. And the second phase, mourning, which is a more active work of a second psychological phase that people pass into to process the loss of someone. And I knew about that from my literary studies. I was good at going up on my Freud, but I didn't really know very much more than that. What we have learned since some of the first studies of grief began to emerge in the 1970s in ways that were slightly more complex than Freud's, and what we've learned even more since the 1990s is that grief comes in all shapes and forms, and there can be many, many triggers of it. So it can be a form of personal loss, and that doesn't mean it just happens at death. It can happen at diagnosis as well. It can be related, therefore, to illness or disability. It can be related to relationship breakdown or divorce as well. So grief is related not just to death, but lots of kinds of personal loss. And I think, as your reading by Harjo demonstrates this week, it can also, of course, be related to cultural loss. And studies on the Holocaust have actually been really important for getting us to understand and come to grips with how cultural loss and trauma can be passed down through generations. It can also be related to loss of place or displacement. Grief itself, as I've intimated already, is a very disorienting kind of feeling. It disorders priorities and what feels important in your world. And in that, in itself, it can be bewildering. But I want to take us back to that etymology of bewilderment to remind you that our sense of belonging or having an orderly life that's predictable and has attachments is deeply related to our sense of place and space. And so displacement, whether that's forced displacement because of war, such as in the case of asylum seekers and refugees, or borders being changed in countries, incarceration of any kind can be, of course, riddled with grief. And loss of country, of course, for First Nations people, the stolen generation, people who were removed from country, put into institutions, put, as we have had the community of Palm Island formed in North Queensland, in a different place from their own home country. But even just related to voluntary migration, as in the case of mine, can lead to a form of grief too. And here we get a really interesting word that came to us I think about 2005, an Australian researcher introduced a term called solastalgia. And it's related to grief around displacement, but it's also related to the emerging acknowledgement that there is a thing called climate grief. And there are a lot of researchers working on how people are relating to climate change in terms of grief and symptomatics of grief too. Now, you can read that on the slide on your own and how this researcher came up with this term solastalgia. But its basic idea is a place that used to give you solace doesn't anymore, maybe because it's been profoundly changed environmentally, perhaps in the case of Maralinga, which was the site of atomic bomb testing in Australia, made toxic, perhaps in the case of mined, sacred sites destroyed, logging destroyed, strip malls replacing, villages or rural areas. And I certainly experienced, I think, a bit of solastalgia for myself too, going back to my home country or the place I grew up many years later after the death of my mother, and feeling it as a very desolate place, a place where, in fact, I only have two living relatives left, and one of whom doesn't speak to me anymore. So there's grief with that. A more recent form of grief since the pandemic people have begun to experience is, of course, related to the loss of work or the loss of a predictable income or a sense of status or security in regard to work. And that's really only just being theorized. And there's also a term of grief called disenfranchised grief, which is grief that we don't really even kind of publicly acknowledge this kind of grief. So you can see that over time we've begun to publicly acknowledge more and more kinds of grief. But as yet, there are still obviously kinds of grief that we haven't acknowledged or found words to talk about. It can be very alienating for people to feel grief that they can't name, particularly when grief itself is a disorienting experience. Disenfranchised grief actually was a term that was introduced by hospice workers in the 1980s and psychologists who were supporting grieving families and people through the last phases of their death, when they were realizing in the first wave of the aftermath of generalized family breakdown and divorce being more pervasive, that there were widows who were technically not called widows because they were perhaps the ex-spouse of a divorced partner, and they weren't welcome at the funeral, they weren't part of the inheritance, they didn't go through the rituals that would pass the melancholy into mourning of actively working through grief, because it wasn't acknowledged that they would feel grief for somebody that they had divorced or had left to them. And that term has now been more broadly used to describe all kinds of grief that we don't really culturally acknowledge or have words for. And that's related to, but also distinct from, complex grief, which is grief that psychologists say lasts longer than it should. Grief, they say it should last 3 to 5 years or something in the DSM. They have a general sense of how long grief should last. Many people will tell you that grief never goes away. You just learn to live with it. But psychologists say complex grief is something that lasts usually beyond 5 years, or that in which the grief of one kind of grief, like personal loss, is compounded by some other kind of grief, like cultural loss or displacement or work loss at the same time. So that just gives us some terms to begin to thinking about grief and all kinds of different disorientations that are grief related that people can think about beginning to narrate their way through. And as you're listening to this lecture, maybe you might want to start doodling and making a list for yourself about what sorts of ways you've experienced grief in your life. It doesn't need to be some massive event. Sometimes it can be something quite small, and but it like the death of a cat, for example. Some people would say, "Oh, that's small. Don't get over it," but other people would relate to it on a very, very profound level. That is a family member to them. I mean, you could call that a kind of disenfranchised grief. So if you're doodling away, just doodle the kinds of grief that maybe you think you've experienced, or maybe begin to think about whether there's parts of your life that have had as yet unnamed forms of grief, and just allow yourself to sit with that. And I want to tell you something now that's going to be super nerdy, because it's about the way I reacted to my grief. And I reacted to my grief in ways that I thought were unpredictable or unpredicted. And they were related to my work. Actually, it's really deeply rooted my identity in my work as a literary scholar, as an academic. And I hadn't expected grief to so unsettle my relationship with my primary source of livelihood, which was reading and writing. And in fact, that is exactly what it did. And it eventually changed the way I think about work that we do and its meaning in literary studies, and how I approach that differently now. Now, I've said already, my mother's death was the shift to my beginning to write, but writing came as a surprise to me at that point in my life. Perhaps because of my literary training, I'd been trained to think that literature was something only great people could write, that it had to be so amazing and so perfect and such a classic, and how dare I ever deign to do such a thing. So as I said, I saw myself as a dabbler, as an essayist. Of course, I write articles, but I never really expected to take on a personal dimension to my creative writing. And what was most surprising to me was that writing started to come at all, because the first way that grief surfaced for me in the immediate wake of my mother's terminal diagnosis was by way of feeling blocked. I didn't go through immediately any kind of writer's block, but it was more like a reader's block. And I'd never heard anyone use this phrase before, but I just felt like the books I was reading and analyzing and talking about from my literary career, they no longer really seemed to matter to me, and I just could not find any joy in them. And I started Googling, as you do these days, Reddit threads and stuff, reader's block, what's going on? And I found this old article in The Nation, and it was published in 1993, where a very well-known American essayist and writer, Barbara Ehrenreich, actually coined the phrase reader's block. And she said, Most people have figured out by now that print is the medium of intimidation, expropriation, and threat. When someone has something nice to say, they say it with pictures or flowers, etc. But when there's nastiness to flip, which is most of the time, the forewarning always comes in cold print. Thus, TV, which is our friend, does not assault us with words, while the welfare department, which wishes us dead, does not communicate with jolly cartoons. The problem, then, she says, is not that people are dumb. So the problem people were beginning to talk about in the 1990s was that people are reading less. And now people are watching TV more, dying down with the population. She says the problem isn't that people are dumb. The problem is in this era of late corporate capitalist bureaucratic society, there's not a whole lot one would willingly read. And most of the things that one should read, such as the mail, are so relentlessly hostile to the human spirit that refusing to read may be the only dignified course of action. So mass illiteracy, she said, must be seen for what it is, a quiet, determined, postmodern form of rebellion. And I had a bit of a laugh at that in the way that she talked about, reading and the print media in particular being such a form of assault for us these days. Certainly it can feel like that even in our Google News feed in the morning. When we look at all these horrors that are happening in Afghanistan, and more statistics on climate change, it just feels like a place of assault. But now Erin Reich is just tongue-in-cheek. She's a bit jolly about this, about the way print culture at the time of late capitalism drove her to find solace in TV, which I suppose in today's terms would be something like, our Netflix or our streaming service aptly named Binge. But I think Erin Reich is actually onto something, and not just in her darkly ironic sort of way. We're at least 20 years past when she wrote this now, right? Like maybe even 30, I deign to not say, because it makes me feel old. But society has taken a lot more on since then in terms of the things that we are processing in this era of late capitalism. Perhaps you could even say that we're 20 years into what some would call, the apocalypse. Now, I'm talking about reader's block because I'd experienced a kind of block before with things I used to find joy in and be good at that I couldn't do anymore. And I'm going to give you a trigger warning here because now I'm going to talk about something that happened to me in high school. And so there's a rape, sexual assault thing I'm going to talk about here. And if you want to stop listening, that's fine. But for me, I've just made a cultural, political decision that I think it's really important for me to talk about these things, and for people, if they feel well enough, to talk about these sorts of things more. Because I think the more we learn to be articulate about these sorts of experiences as society, the more compassionate maybe we can become. Anyway, I did experience a kind of block like this before, but not with reading or writing, but with math. I was in an international baccalaureate program in advanced IB calculus in my senior year in high school, getting straight A's. And that was the same year I was raped, just before I turned 16, before I even began my learner's driver's license. And suddenly, the summer after that happened, I could no longer even understand the concept of math. I had to hire a tutor. I'd never hired a tutor in my life to help me with something on the side. I scraped my way through that subject to a bare pass. A bare pass in math was not going to get me into honors psychology, which was my course of study then. Instead, I started questioning even the very premise of psychology, its implied norms and its power dynamics. I read Foucault and trauma theory and women's life writing, and my English lecturers, they got me, but they also gave me language for what I was beginning to experience. They not only allowed me, but encouraged me to write the most bizarre honors English thesis on women's badness ever, perhaps comparing the narrative of a medieval mystic with the surrealist writing of a surrealist painter and writer, Leonora Carrington. But language opened something up inside of me that was blocked and expanded the limits of what was then, until then, to me, sayable and knowable. And in it, I found a way, finally, again, to be okay. And a path that eventually took me into literary studies and studies of social justice, to settler colonial theory, to thinking about post-colonialism, and eventually all the way to Australia. So it was with a sense of highly inconvenient deja vu when I began to experience a version of my earlier kind of like, aphasia for math, some brain trauma I had had for math, erasing my ability to understand something that I used to find joy in and do well, happening in the field for which I was trained, literature. And it wasn't until I read Susan Sontag's classic 1967 essay, Against Interpretation, around that time that I began to find words for what I was experiencing then in that period of my life. So I began to wonder maybe if what I was going through in terms of reading and my changed relationship in reading being related to some stuff that I was seeing with my students as well. I know that there's always some resistance of students to read stuff that teachers teach that always feels very outdated, and why is this important to us? But I began to suspect that some of my students perhaps also had similar experiences of like a reader's block, where maybe it wasn't just a cultural trigger in something, but they just couldn't do work in literary studies or read the way they used to anymore. And so some of you may have been a part of a poll I began to do, a study I'm doing on reading right now, where I asked a question like this: has there ever been an event in your life that stopped you from or slowed you down from reading? And my 18 participants, all except for I think maybe one, said yes. And many of them were identifying things like depression, anxiety, trauma, impacting their ability to read. Somebody even said like reader's block, and I had never given them the word when I was asking them that. So I began thinking, is there something we're doing in the field of literary studies that doesn't acknowledge these forms of affect, these ways that people engage with reading or disengage with reading? I even began to wonder if what we were doing in literary studies was a form of cultural violence. So in Susan Sontag's essay, I really found language, I think, for the issues that I felt like I was starting to go through in literary studies at this time. The earliest experience of art, Sontag wrote in her classic essay, must have been incantatory, magical. Now, she goes on to argue, we lay a grid of interpretation over art. She claims we do a kind of violence to it, strip mine it for meaning, valorize abstraction. It's not the thing that matters, but what we say about the thing. And Sontag believes that this modern style of interpretation has lost sensitivity to textuality, to creativity, to experience that we're trying to find a path for in language, but rather strives to excavate and even destroy the original body of art. And she characterizes literary studies even as an extractive industry, one that busies itself with processing texts through other texts, spitting them out in some other more academic form. And I think that was how I had felt for a while about math. I'd lost the understanding of the purpose of what we were doing. And in both cases, like I said, it was like I developed a kind of aphasia. An image popped in my mind that represented a kind of factory production in which we crunched symbols through these, machines like sausage makers that popped out the other end with other symbols on the other end. And the closest image I came to that was Dr. Seuss's Story of the Sneetches and Sylvester Monkey McBean's Starbelly Sneetch Machine. I dedicated my life to studying literature, but now the meaning of most literary work, especially literary criticism, seems hollowed out to me and disconnected from life. And gradually I found my way back to books. Of course I did. But when I did, it took me a while to realize that's what I was even doing, because I wasn't reading the things I had been told ought to matter in terms of literary studies. I was reading a lot of nonfiction, for one, a lot of creative nonfiction. First of all, I was reading a lot of airport books. I discovered this one of my favorite memoirs I'll talk about in a moment. In doing so, I described these ones as well. These are three that have all been published within about the last 12 months or so, Australian memoirs by women about various kinds of grief. And I just couldn't stop reading these kinds of narratives during this period. At the same time, I also began to discover that I was writing poetry, which kind of I hadn't done for a very long time, actually, since I was about 16 years old when I was raped, and trying to find some language for what the heck was going on inside of me in the aftermath of that. It was probably awful, like existential, terrible teenager approaches to it, but I just felt compelled, and I found myself reading a lot of poetry at this time as well. And I felt like I had cracked a bit, but through reading these narratives, I felt like I wasn't alone, and they started to crack me open, and poetry did too. And while rolling sets of crises were hitting the world, the pandemic, the bushfires, the more reports on ice fields in Antarctica, falling, collapsing, shelving, I, began to see that perhaps I was experiencing a slightly different form of what Rose Michael and Jane Lawson described in their essay contribution to a recently published anthology called Reading Like an Australian Writer, which I highly recommend. An essay they called Reading Crisis / Writing Crisis. They were talking about more generally how we write crisis, but also maybe what we need to read. These things being at a crossroads at this point in time. My reading crisis led to this disorienting process that began in me. I began to write narratives a little bit like this, and of course my horrible poetry. And I was appalled, because as an academic you're supposed to write about serious things, but I was writing about my life. And it was not that I didn't have an issue with being vulnerable. I've lived my life on Facebook for 20 years and I overshare on a regular basis, but I was appalled, I think, that I was writing about my life in a format that I'd been trained to take very seriously as literature. But I couldn't not do this in this period in my life. So I've indulged in this long preamble today, partly by way of explaining that and why, at least in this point in my life, I found I couldn't do literary scholarship quite the way I did before. And also to explain that, of course, as a scholar of narrative, I began to use narrative to find my way back to the land of the living, but needed, I found, to do scholarship a bit differently than I did before. And all of this led me to experience and contemplate the role of grief in the formation and reformation of the self. And I think we can see that happening in lots of different ways in grief narratives. It was natural that as I both read the scholarly and popular literature on grief, I began to reflect on maybe what grief has to teach all fields of our work right now. And for me, it's the academy. And for more broadly, I began to think about the ways we think about work, and even literary work, of course, about reading and writing and interpretation in connection to our personal and social and public lives, wherever and however we live them. So I'm going to end that second part of my preamble there, and finish my third and fourth part of my preambles next. But what I've begun to suggest to you is that grief is a profoundly disorienting experience. Actually, just before I end, I want to go back to this memoir, because I do think that when you look at this shelf of grief narratives, we can begin to sort of make some gendered assumptions about, will women indulge in emotion, and it's perhaps a more female form of writing than male form. I think that's a facile way of thinking about gender personally. I do think that perhaps there's a bigger market for publishers to write memoirs by women about grief. I also have personal conversations with some of my writing colleagues about the challenges that men feel in terms of writing about their grief, and maybe the way that they were socialized, perhaps especially with older men, men who are socialized to just stiff upper lip, get on with it. So what? You were raped when you were 7. Other worse things have happened to other people, and maybe that's a reason we're finding that more narratives about grief tend to be written by women than men. But I think we are seeing a new generation of male writers writing about grief. So there's an Australian writer, his name escapes me right now, but he wrote 100 Years of Dirt. He's recently written a book called My Year of Living Vulnerably. Men beginning to do this. But this is one I discovered as well during my period of beginning to sort of devour these narratives of grief. And it was called To Begin to Know by David Lester, who's a very famous Australian journalist, Walking in the Shadows of My Father. And it was about two kinds of grief. It was about the grief of losing his work as a journalist, as we're seeing, the academy completely fall apart right now. When print journalism moved to the internet in the early years of the 2000s, we saw that industry change completely, and many people lose their jobs as well. And so he is writing about that, and about losing his father, and also about the breakdown of his marriage in this narrative. And I find it a very perceptive narrative, also about complicated grief and grief in ways that intertwine. Many of these narratives, even ones like Your Own Kind of Girl by Claire Bowditch, or No Matter Our Wreckage by Gemma Carey, or The Girls by Chloe Higgins, often have one major narrative thread of grief that they're looking at or following. But in following that, it often opens up wounds in other areas of their lives that perhaps they hadn't explored, they hadn't healed from before. I'm not going to plot spoil any of these books, but just as Lessers then becomes about intertwining forms of grief, these books do as well, and that is something that is quite common. So let's just stop that. Now, I'm going to give you an exercise, which is a grounding exercise, because when we're talking about grief, we're talking about affect and emotion, things that often impact our bodies and our spirits and our souls, our gut, before we can process them and make sense of them in our head or have language for them. It can often be a very unsettling part of writing grief, in that grief feels very raw and very visceral, but is often languagelessness. It is its first experience. That kind of aphasia I talked about is quite common, of like mute, not being able to speak, not being able to share, not because you don't want to, but because there's just not language for that yet in your head or for other people in ways that they recognize. And so there is this paradox at the heart of grief. It's very visceral, very raw, but often feels languageless. And so I think that's why I turned to poetry in this period. And I think that you'll find there are a lot of anchoring details in the memoirs that you're looking at this week that are very grounding. But just as I asked you to maybe think about in the first part of the lecture some aspect of grief in your life, or write down some aspect of grief in your life, now look at that list and think about if there's something that maybe you'd like to try and write about today. Maybe as just an exercise in thinking about how you might explore memoir later on. I found poetry really, really helpful in terms of giving me visceral language for a nonsensical experience, and not needing to master it with my mind, but just letting myself flow through it, letting words just flow the way tears just come, right? And so I want us to do an exercise which poetry teachers quite often teach, and it's a grounding exercise which teaches you to write from the five senses. And I'm going to ask you to think about one of those things you wrote down that was grief surrounded for you. You might choose to write about something that's like less of a trigger emotionally, like something that you feel less sad or less disoriented about than something that's a bit more fresh and raw for you. Or you might decide to dig deep and go into something really deep for yourself. But it's really important when we're working through writing grief that we move beyond our intellectual minds, beyond our conceptual way of thinking, and find ways to access our gut and access our heart and allow words to do that. And so writing from the senses becomes really important when you're writing about grief. And if you want to stop this lecture here, I'm going to give you a little clip from a dear friend of mine who wrote a poem during the first season of lockdown in March 2020 called Mid-Crisis Life. And he wrote a poem about having no source of income and like raising a young family, and basically the only place he could find a quiet to do his work at that point in his life was his cold garage. And he wrote a poem about that. I'm going to share you a clip with that. And I'm also going to share an exercise that he taught me. He's a poetry mentor of mine, but lots of poetry teachers teach, which is a grounding exercise that I want you to try to explore and write a little poem about grief. So thanks for listening to the end of part 2. And then we'll get into that exercise. And then I have 2 short further parts of this lecture. Thanks.